really be a wonderful marriage because it's two places that get along very well. They like each other a lot.
Well, if I may, as you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
That's true.
We're sitting in one right now, Buckingham Palace that you visited as well.
That's true.
And having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever. But the opportunity is in the partnership and what we can build together.
There's our Prime Minister telling President Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump, that Canada will never be for sale. Let's get more from David Oliver, public affairs strategist and founder at Minerva Strategy. I know these are serious issues. It's not meant to be theatre, but I guess politics is there's always going to be an element of performance. But were you impressed with what Carney said, the tone he struck yesterday?
Yeah, I think everybody's marking for how well the meeting went was that there was no disaster and that he handled Trump well. And dealt with the curveballs that Trump continued to throw, and in particular, I guess the tropes around the 51st state and the other things that I guess he likes to use to potentially offset the people that are in front of him. Carney did well. He did well in terms of making sure that there was no big news coming out of the meeting. There was no Zelensky-type incidents, and I think everybody's sense of that was the pass mark for making sure that he handled Trump well. He then obviously gave the press conference we saw afterwards, where he went into more detail at the Canadian embassy in Washington and gave a firmer sense of his sense of positivity, which you would expect him to say because he's marking his own homework there. But do we have any definitive news from that meeting or any of the events yesterday? No, it just wasn't bad.
Is there any signal that, it's important, obviously, to our economy, much more important to our economy than America, the cross-border trade relationship. Do you think there's any signal that we'll get some substantial resolution of this trade war in the near term?
Yeah, and we saw, Trump talked about USMCA, or customers, we might prefer to call it, being still it sounded like that's going to be the main vehicle for how we see where things go. I think if Carney had wanted one win coming out of yesterday, which didn't come, was do we see some relief on some of the immediate tariffs that have come in, particularly automotive, because that's the really sensitive one for us, for Canada, with the US at the moment. Steel and aluminum are obviously really important too. And I guess that would have been one of a big win that would have come out of yesterday would have been some relief on those as we go into a renegotiation around customer. But obviously that didn't come. So we wait to see.
You reckon that Trump has shown signs of being obsessed with where auto factories are. But of course, it's not that simple, is it? We've got global cars. GM products made in Korea or parts moving all around the world. Is he simplistic in his attitude? Well, the plant should be in America.
Others can deduce as to what they think that Donald Trump's heuristics are on how he sees the world. He's been very clear that he wants to see. He has this obsession with things that he believes are important being made in the US. He believes that, and he said this yesterday, there was no relief on steel because he believes that an important sign of a strength of a country that it makes its own steel. And he said that again yesterday. And he seems to have this obsession the same way with cars, that the cars are both made in the US and that they're made with US steel. I had some interesting conversations with some of my contacts yesterday, particularly in the mining industry, and thinking about some of the things that Trump is trying to do. He's trying to go really fast on reshoring elements of the US economy, which are impossible to do in the timeframes that he wants to do. But does he get some totemic, or does he get some symbolic, rather, wins of what some of those things might be? Well, he'll claim Donald Trump is in some ways a bit like some of the people that we disparage in perhaps the non-democracies of the world, in the sense that he has a base that if he claims a win, he can claim that win with his base. Everybody else will take a view as to whether it's really a win or not. But, again, we see with these trade deals that still haven't come through, whatever deals, and I'm going to put some inverted commas around those, they're more likely to be agreements. I'm sure he will celebrate as massive things, and we're promised there's going to be something this week. I guess the big news that's really come out in the last 24 hours is that we've heard that there's going to be the preliminary talks with China, with Besant, and the US trade representative are going to start happening in Switzerland this weekend. And I think that's what everybody's really watching, because that is where the big show is.
Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and said three crucial elements to their economic policy are tariffs, tax cuts, and deregulation.
Yeah.
Talk about the last one. I mean, do we have in Canada and the USA an economy that's plagued with NIMBYism and red tape?
Well, the regulation bit, I think, if you think about some of the big things he's trying to do, or that the US broader establishment, this administration is trying to do, they want new factories. They want to have things processed and made in the US. And we know that the big challenges for the US is the permitting arrangements, and that is a problem in Canada as well.
And lots of countries, I guess.
Absolutely, because we have developed, rule of law democracies where we have regulations developed because they're there for a purpose. They're there for environmental protection, or for the protection of the communities, or there are lots of other reasons why they're there. And what was interesting about that Bessent op-ed is he's kind of, in some ways, he's talks about the first two being supported by the third. So the first two being tariffs and tax cuts being supported by deregulation. It's actually probably the other way round. You actually want the deregulation in order that people are attracted to be able to build the things you want. And then the other two you start to use as the tools to get more reshoring of the things that then happen.
I mean, it does sometimes seem like there's an industry out there involved in creating difficulties for projects. There's consultants, there's lawyers. In Ireland, actually, at one stage it developed, there was a small blackmail industry. People would object to a project or a development, and then it turned out they were going to the proposers and saying, hey, we'll withdraw our objections if you'll give us some money. There was a cottage industry. I don't know how widespread that is.
Yeah. I can't necessarily speak to some of those things that might be happening, but what we do know, particularly in terms of how the US operates, is this is also where congressional politics and local politics start to play a role as well, because a lot of the way that US congressional elected representatives think about what's going on in their districts and the sorts of things and incentives that they're going to get in their districts to build that next plant, or to build that next processing facility, or whatever it might be. And I think that's going to be the interesting thing to watch, where do you see a push on really trying to get change on deregulation? And by the way, this is also a conversation that's happening on the Democrat side of the fence as well. I think there are people in the Democrat side of the fence that have started to acknowledge that the US can't do the things, even when we had Biden's IRA legislation, the US can't do the things it wants to do. So I think this is going to be an interesting debate.
A sclerotic approvals process.
Absolutely. And you said, is this a problem we have in Canada as well? Yes, it absolutely is. And so when we think about the things that we want to do to really transform our economy, and some of those will be very controversial things as we start to hear things about pipelines, as we start to hear things about how we get the energy that we have in this country, not just to the US and being overly dependent on selling to the US, but other parts of the world, then what does that start to look like? Because that's when you start to get into these regulatory permitting issues.
I think one point you've made to us that's very interesting is that this American reinvention of the relationship with China and these perennial deficits, you say, really got going under President Obama.
Yeah, and this was the point at which, and again, not going into heavy amounts of international relations theory, but if we had a very neoliberalist era which dominated after the Cold War up until roughly the Great Financial Crisis, the deregulation of the world economy and being able to get everything that you wanted from wherever you wanted to buy in the world was what ruled, if you like. We are now in a very different era, where the US noticed actually this economy that it had built up, which it believed was going to be a benign economy, wouldn't be an economy that would invest in its military, suddenly did. And it suddenly has a big competitor in the Far East, which is going to threaten its interest there, and particularly as we start to think about the broader issues around Taiwan, the 9-dash line, the US's relationships with all of those different countries. But I mean, Taiwan is really the principal focus of that. That is where the US is significantly challenged, and that's why we've seen this pivot.
What was that middle thing you said, the 9-dash line?
The 9-dash line.
What's that?
The 9-dash line is how China regards its, if you like, extended, more than a sphere of influence, but almost effectively a de facto extension of its economic zone into an area of the South China and East China Sea, and this is why you see lots of low-level conflicts with nations like the Philippines, its relationships with countries like Vietnam. And this is the interesting thing for the US, because the one thing that has been seen successful broadly in the last couple of months with US foreign policy has been the visits it's had to those countries it sees as more natural allies in the East, Japan, South Korea, but also its relationships with countries like Philippines and Vietnam. But yeah, it still slaps a massive tariff on Vietnam, even though it should be a natural ally for it in its competition with China.
Of course, the Vietnamese have been battling the Chinese for centuries, or at least in conflict with them. We better jump, though. Thanks very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Our guest has been David Oliver, public affairs strategist and founder at Minerva Strategy. Coming up,